So most of you know that I was able to take a sabbatical break this past summer. For those of you who don't know what a sabbatical is, it's an intentional pause to kind of step away, typically after about 6 years of ministry, and I've been here a little bit over 8, but I was able to step away and relax and refuel and kind of reflect. And so there was about six weeks that we did some traveling and did a lot of really fun things. But one of the things I was able to do in that 6 weeks is to ask myself some questions, to have a break and to be able to kind of check in with myself and ask about, how am I doing? I'm about halfway through ministry, halfway into my ministry, about 20 years, and I feel like there's probably another 20 years ahead. But there's always a good reason to step aside and to retreat and to say, hey, how am I doing? And not just as a pastor, but as a person, as a Christian. How am I maturing in my faith? How am I growing? How am I in this process of spiritual formation? How are things going inside of me? Am I becoming a more loving person? I think that's a great question that Jesus always wants us to ask, for us to step back and say, am I growing in my capacity to love people? Is my heart becoming softer towards people around me, towards situations, towards different viewpoints? Am I becoming a softer person? How is my spiritual journey playing out? Am I maturing the way that I want? Well, in some cases, the answer to the question was yes, I'm actually moving in the direction that I want. And then in other cases, I was like, well, got some work to do in that particular area. Yep, you probably have experienced that at different points. But you might be, one of the things that I had to kind of keep myself from doing is grading myself. You know, we're always in this kind of production-oriented viewpoint. That's kind of the culture that we live in. Performance-based, and so I had to kind of resist the desire to kind of get, I've got an A there, but then I've got a C over here, and then I'm kind of in the middle. I give myself a strong B or B plus in this particular area, and I think that probably a lot of us probably struggle with that performance-based culture. We want to chart our progress. We want to say, I'm making my way from this step to this step to this step towards spirituality, towards a deeper spiritual heart, towards the heart of Christ. And so let me ask you that question. When you think about spiritual formation, how are things going for you? Do you feel like you're maturing in your faith the way that you hope to, the way that you feel called to? Spend a moment just thinking about that. Because I feel like that's one of the primary callings of the church. I would love to hear from you if you feel like the church is really coming alongside you and offering opportunities and resources and inspiration in your own spiritual formation, in your maturing in your faith. Because I feel like ultimately the goal, my great hope for this place is that this would be a place that literally this community transforms lives, that people are deeply shaped and changed by their experience here. So this morning we begin a brand new teaching series entitled Transforming Community. It's a series about our shared journey of spiritual formation. Now, some of you might not be familiar with that term of spiritual formation. We're going to be unpacking that term over the next several weeks. Basically, we're going to be kind of gleaning a lot of insight from an author, Henry Nouwen, somebody that I have counted as kind of a spiritual mentor. I think he's mentored millions and millions of people through the years. He died several decades ago, but his voice still resonates. This is the book that we're going to be drawing from. It's entitled Spiritual Formation. And in this book, he gives us a great definition for what spiritual formation is. Spiritual formation is the Spirit's work to actively reshape our minds, our hearts, and our hands. So I'll be referring back to this on a pretty regular basis. So spiritual formation is reshaping our minds, so it's the way that we think. It's our heart, so from a biblical sense, the heart is the place where we understand and discern. So it's not about sentiment, but it's more about discernment, and understanding happens in your heart. And then obviously it always has to translate to our hands. Has to translate to how we live, from our mind to our heart and then to our hands. So let me ask you a question. How does spiritual formation happen for you? I expect that probably many in this room have engaged trying to move forward in spiritual formation, trying to mature. How does it happen for you? What are the things that you do to try to help you continue in this reshaping process? What do you do? Okay, sometimes you're called outside of your comfort zone. Yeah. I was over at the Goddard's house this week, and I know that these two right here have been, how long have you been set aside your time in the morning for devotion and reading and prayer? How long has it been? Yeah, 20 or 25 years, consistently reading in devotion, probably different passages, but then also prayer. And so that's become an anchor in their life. And so I want to just kind of encourage you to try to find what those practices are that can really help you to grow and to mature and deepen in your relationship with God. But I want you to know that spiritual formation, it's really not about steps and stages and running a race, but rather it's about reuniting with God, with ourselves, and with others. And it starts not with kind of arrogantly saying, this is where I stand, this is what I believe to be true, but rather Nouwen counsels us that it's a lot more about humble unknowing. So let me read this passage to you real quick, or this from his book. He says, we might be competent in many subjects, but we can't become an expert in the things of God. God is greater than our minds and cannot be caught within our boundaries, the boundaries of our finite concepts. Thus, spiritual formation leads us not to a proud understanding of divinity, but to a docta ignorantia, an articulate not knowing. Now think about that for just a moment. Nouwen claims that the goal is kind of an eloquent ignorance. That we would come to a place where we recognize and we're able to articulate how little we know. I would expect, and I'm going to pick on Linda and Richard just a little bit, I would expect that all of their pursuit and all of their reading and thinking and praying and processing has actually led them to a realization of how little they know, not how much they know. And so spiritual formation starts with that recognition. When I stand here before you every single week, I am painfully aware of how inadequate my knowledge is to talk of God. That sometimes it's embarrassing how little I feel I know of God, because God just continues to expand and expand and expand. The more I try to press in, the more God seems to just become so vast and so mysterious and yet so good and so beautiful. So Nouwen offers several movements. This is what he suggests. It's not about steps and stages and success, but it's about movements, spirit-led movements. Now, the first movement that he talks about is moving from hiddenness to transparency. From hiddenness to transparency. Let me read this passage to you from 2 Corinthians. Therefore, since we have such a hope, we are very bold. We are not like Moses, who had put a veil over his face to prevent the Israelites from seeing the end of what was passing away. But their minds were made dull. For to this day, the same veil remains when the old covenant is read. It has not been removed because only in Christ it is taken away. Even to this day, when Moses is read, a veil covers their hearts. But whenever anyone turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And we all who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory are being transformed into his image with ever-increasing glory, which comes from the Lord who is the Spirit. Now, the first revelation of God that the people understood was the law. But the law offered a veiled picture of God. There was no way that the law could really unveil who God was. It only gave little glimpses. It was basically like a guide that would kind of help people to walk in the direction of God with the idea of finding God one day. But the law could never reveal God until Jesus came and a veil was removed. So there was a veil over the eyes. They could only understand God to a degree. But then when Jesus came, he removed the veil and enabled people to actually enter into this transformation process that is talked about, being transformed into the image of ever-increasing glory. It was only when Jesus came that we could gaze upon the fullness of God and be transformed by that encounter. So, one of the other great spiritual voices of our time is Thomas Merton. And Thomas Merton says, in order for us to remove the veil, okay, we have to become contemplatives. We have to become contemplatives. How many of you guys are familiar with the term contemplative? Some of you are. Okay, we need to become contemplative people. He writes this of being contemplative. This is what it means to be contemplative people. The contemplative is the person who sees things for what they really are, who sees the real connections of how things hang together, and who knows the real scoop on things. How many of you guys really want to know the real scoop about life? How many of you guys along the way have kind of asked yourself the question, am I missing something? I mean, isn't life maybe more than what I'm understanding it to be? I'm pursuing these different things in my life, but there's something inside of me that tells me there's something more. I'm missing the scoop, right? I think I've said that to myself many, many different times. And what Merton tries to tell us is that the contemplative person is the person that has the ability to remove the blinders, to be able to see life for what it really was meant to be, and to employ a spiritual practice called praktike. Okay, praktike is literally daily entering into a process of removing the blinders so that we can see a little bit better each day. So let me get real practical with you, okay? Because I know that we're kind of staying in this kind of abstract philosophical place. So there's 3 different ways that Nouwen leads us to remove the blinders, okay? The first one, we remove the blinders of nature, to see nature. This is a wonderful quote from Pope Francis. The entire material universe speaks of God's love, his boundless affection for us. Soil, water, mountains, everything is, as it were, a caress of God. I think he's pointing to the fact that the natural world is so much more than we perceive it to be. Most of us realize that before the law and before Jesus, the way that people understood God was by looking at the natural world around them and learning about God through just being in nature and noticing, pausing long enough to notice. Sometimes we can fall into this trap of when we see a tree, we see a chair. When we see a mountain, we see just resources to be mined. When we see a river, we see a mode of transportation or maybe a disposal source of some kind. When we see a flower, we see a decoration. But with eyes unveiled, we would see these different things as so much more than that we would actually regain the ministry. And this is the thing that Nouwen talks about that's so beautiful, the ministry of nature. That we would actually, when we walk down the beautiful paths that are prepared for us to enjoy here in Kingwood and surrounding communities, that we would engage in the ministry of nature. The natural world would become a healer and a counselor and a teacher for us. Yesterday, I decided I was going to practice this. So I went out and I found just a tree. It was beautiful yesterday. If you were outside, the sun's coming down through the leaves. So I intentionally took my shoes off and I put my hands in the soil. I leaned back against the tree. And then before long, we're in Texas, so the ants started on my feet and I was like, okay, I'm just going to let them. I don't think they're going to bite me, and they didn't. They didn't bite me, but they started. And then I looked up, and first of all, I felt the bark, and I turned around, and have you ever paid attention to the beautiful fingerprints of a tree through its bark? And the story that the bark tells. And then I looked up and I saw the flickering of the light through the leaves. And I was looking up and I started kind of humming because there was a bird that was singing from the tree, from a neighboring tree. And then right as I was really getting into it, somebody walked by and said, "Are you okay?" I was like, well, that's about right, and he was like, he thought something was wrong because I was just leaning against a tree somewhere. I encourage you guys, I don't know why I told that story, but I encourage you guys to reclaim the ministry of nature. The second one that Nouwen talks about is removing our blinders to time. Time is this beautiful commodity that is ours, and oftentimes we talk about it as though we never have enough time. How many times this week has someone said, "Hey, can I have a moment of your time?" As though we think about it kind of as a commodity or as in a quantitative way or quantitative understanding of time, like it's a resource that's going to finally run out, and it is when we think about it in that way. When we think about quantitative time or chronos time, then it's just a random set of events that don't really have a connection. But Jesus actually claimed the word kairos. Kairos is a way in which we celebrate and we recognize that every single moment is a spiritual opportunity. Now, Nouwen writes this. He says, once we discover that everything is a spiritual opportunity, he says, once we discover that, then writing emails or attending classes, students attending classes, visiting friends, cooking food, and even washing dishes are not a series of random activities, but contain a transforming recreation power. Now, I was with him until he said dishes. I mean, I think I can claim all of those other things as like spiritual opportunities, but when he got to dishes, I was like, no way. There is nothing that I'm learning about God while I'm doing dishes. But to be more serious, if we embrace kairos time, if we embrace the spirituality of the moment, if we embrace that little whisper that says, there's more here, then we can embrace time as sacred windows. This moment, a sacred window. That if we remove our blinders, we can see, we can receive it, we can be nourished by it, and not be held by time, but we can celebrate and be nourished by time. The last one, removing our blinders to see people. How easily we fall into the trap of categorizing people. We see someone and we say they are this kind of person. We see skin color, black and brown and white. We see somebody who works in a particular place. Well, they're an engineer, or they're a teacher, or they're an accountant, or whatever it is. They're a tech person. You see somebody and because of where they live and well, that's this kind of person or that kind of person. We encounter someone and we immediately say, oh, well, they're interesting, or they're not interesting. They're funny. Oh, that's a funny person. I want to get to know that person. Or they're dull. I'm not sure if I really want to spend time with them. We so quickly categorize people, and yet when we take the blinders off and we see people, then we recognize that they, instead of looking at them in a flat kind of surface orientation, and we look at each other, then we realize that they are divine instruments, divine impersonations of God. Now invites us to kind of look at people through the old French term personner, which actually means sounding through. So this is a really cool thing. Removing our blinders reveals people as divine instruments. So we're seeing God. We're looking through and with and into a person and finding God there, and finding representations of God, divine instruments whose music tells us about God. So let me wrap this up. What Nouwen is really leading us to, and this is not a connection he made, but a connection that I made here. What he's leading us to is to receive the world as a sacrament. A sacrament is a term that basically says it's a sign of a spiritual reality. So if we're willing to take off our blinders, then we would be able to receive the world and even all of life as a sacrament, a sign. It's a pointing finger to say, no, there's more. There's more here. Don't just settle for looking and seeing a person, categorizing a person. There's more. Don't just settle for looking at the world around you, the natural world, and just kind of wallpaper as you make it from point A to point B. No, there's more. Don't just settle for time as a commodity of random events, but there's more. Each moment is a spiritual opportunity. That's a way of making our way and claiming our day-to-day existence, our day-to-day experience of life as a sacrament, a sign of spiritual reality. And so Margaret is going to come and reconnect the communion table as that place of sacrament that points us to a greater spiritual truth